Helen Ann Smith, Beijing correspondent. Welcome back to Trump 100.
Thanks for having me.
How are you? You're in South Korea.
I'm in South Korea. We're a bit tired. It's been a bit full on and it's quite early in the morning, but we are good. We are good. No complaints.
Halloween tonight. Do they celebrate that where you are?
Not really. Actually, if we were to have made it back to Beijing in time, there is usually a bit of a party scene for the expats.
All right.
But it's interesting because the Chinese have really cracked down on Halloween in recent years.
Wow.
Because people kept dressing up as things that were too political. So people would dress up as like COVID workers, party officials, historical figures. And the CCP were like, no, none of that. Absolutely not. So people get arrested if you dress up, seriously.
Oh,
so
wow.
it's all a bit risky.
Well, I can tell you Halloween is alive and well in the United States. I'm going to my neighbours tonight. I'm going to go as myself. That'll scare us kids.
It's original. It's original. We love it. It's iconic, James. Iconic.
I'm James Matthews, and I'm in the Trump 100 studio in Washington, D.C.
And I'm Helen Ann Smith in Busan, South Korea, where Donald Trump met Xi Jinping. The US president seems happy with how it went. He's rated it a 12 out of 10.
On the podcast today, what happened when Donald met Xi and what does it all mean? There is also the small matter of nuclear weapons. Donald Trump says America is going to resume testing. Helen Ann, Donald Trump is back here in Washington, D.C. now. He doesn't hang about on these foreign trips, didn't stick around for the delights that Busan, South Korea has to offer. You're there. I gather there isn't actually very much, is there?
Well, actually, the town of Busan itself is actually pretty lovely. It's sort of surrounded by hills, looking out onto the ocean. There's a lovely beach. It's quite nice. But the venue where the two met, that was less so. Pretty functional place for such a consequential meeting. They essentially met in this small airbase, which is part of the airport. And they were in this tiny room. It felt a bit like a weird airport lounge, quite a contrast to the pretty lavish surroundings he's enjoyed as president of the US on this grand Asia tour that he's been on for much of this week. So they met on the sidelines of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, bit of a mouthful, APEC. It's essentially a collection of 21 Asian Pacific countries, and they work together to promote free trade and economic cooperation. It's an important trade bloc in this part of the world, but it was pretty clear all the way up that Donald Trump wasn't that interested in engaging in the summit. He actually left before the bulk of it got underway. He was really here for that meeting with Xi Jinping.
Yeah, it was their first meeting in 6 years, so consequential on a number of levels, also so awkward. They have history, don't they, this pair, a complicated history. In Trump's first term, he kicked off a trade war and put the boot in. Remember when he blamed China for COVID, said it was the China virus, Kung flu, he called it.
Yeah, exactly. And that slight awkwardness was just so stark. We'll, of course, get on to the important things that they discussed. But really, from that very first handshake, you just couldn't help but be struck by this just massive contrast in styles and the way that they behaved. Right from that first handshake, Donald Trump is there. He's dominating the space. He's the one leaning in. He's the one doing all the talking. He's quipping with reporters. At one point, he even made this little joke being like, oh, this guy, he's a tough negotiator, and that's not a good thing. And it was funny, really, because it was just met with a total stony face from Xi Jinping, not so much as a raised eyebrow, just totally inscrutable. And it sounds a bit flippant to talk about body language and whatnot, but I think it's quite important because it just said so much about their totally different styles. Xi Jinping absolutely hates the whole Chinese system, doesn't really respond well to unscripted moments. Donald Trump absolutely lives for them. And it says something, I think, about the potential stumbling blocks that there were going into this meeting. Lots of potential for the Chinese to be embarrassed, and that would have been terrible.
Yeah, that dynamic was fascinating, wasn't it? The interaction, the showman and the straight man. Trump, as you say, buttering him up, telling Xi he was great, his country was great, all about the hype. But it was Xi very, very much about the business. Frictions, he said, were normal between the two leading economies. And there was that stiff reminder that China, won't fall under the shadow of America first. He said, I believe China's development goes hand in hand with your vision to make America great again. I think that's Diplo speak for don't think that America first is going to mean China second.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And that was such an important theme going into it. They essentially met for about 90 minutes, not as long as Donald Trump had originally tailed. He said they'd be talking for 3 to 4 hours, but it ended in a truce of sorts. And there's some really, really key takeaways. Firstly, and most importantly, I think the dispute over rare earth elements that really threatened to ignite the very worst of the trade war between the two
Yeah.
world's largest economies. That, for now, has been de escalated. China's agreed to put a pause for a year on the very worst of the export restrictions that it announced earlier this month. Worth just caveating some of the initial round of export controls absolutely still in place, but a slight reduction on the worst of it. China's also agreed to work on stopping fentanyl precursors getting into the US. Fentanyl, of course, that deadly drug that's fueled so much of the opioid epidemic in parts of the US, and the chemicals used to make it come mostly from China. So Trump, of course, waging his drug war, cutting the flow of those type of chemicals into the country, absolutely key. Uh, and another big thing for Trump in particular, China will start buying US soybeans again. Before the trade dispute, farmers in the Midwest really relied on the Chinese to buy their soybeans. But for months, tariffs and trade disputes have left those farmers hugely out of pocket. It was actually a sector that I think the Chinese very specifically chose to target because they knew it would hurt Trump and his base. So that's a relief for the agricultural sector in the US for sure.
Yeah, this agreement is a pause, isn't it? A retreat by both, but not a big one by any means. Hostilities on trade, they remain, and for all that they have agreed, there's much that remains unresolved. They're still charting a course, I think, for separation economically. And I suppose we do have reason to be sceptical about this truce on trade. The relationship between Washington and Beijing is short on trust. A similar arrangement fell apart in the past, with each of them claiming that it had been broken by the other. Donald Trump, on his way back to Washington on Air Force One, he was, however, keen to accentuate the positive. Marks out of 10, he gave it 12.
I thought it was an amazing meeting. He's a great leader of a very powerful, very strong country, China. But overall, I guess on the scale of from 0 to 10, with 10 being the best, I would say the meeting was a 12. Okay, I think it was a 12. I think very importantly, just the whole relationship is very, very important. And I think it was really good.
The president said they'd agreed to work together to help end the war in Ukraine. Now, they spoke about China's purchase of Russian oil, but he didn't say anything more than that. I suspect, Helen Ann, there wasn't great news to share. Bear in mind, as you well know, that China could do much to intervene in that particular conflict, not just stop buying Russian oil and gas, but also stop supplying the majority of components used to sustain Moscow's war effort. A country that claims to be neutral, China, in this conflict, is very much a player, and the game plan clearly revolves around self-interest, doesn't it? A self-interest that doesn't necessarily involve bending to America's will.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And the whole way through this, China portraying itself as neutral. But look, let's be clear, China doesn't want to see an outcome in the Ukraine war that favors America too much. And I don't think it's going to retreat from that position for sure. TikTok is the other thing that didn't actually get much of a mention at all. And that was a bit surprising because the Americans had been saying that a deal on that was completely in the bag and it just needed to be signed off. Trump, remember, was looking for the Chinese to sign off on a deal that would essentially carve off the American facing part of the Chinese owned social media app and put it into majority American hands. But he didn't mention it in his comments on Air Force One. And China's Ministry of Commerce said only that Beijing would work with the US to resolve issues related to TikTok. So still, I think, a bit of working out there to be done.
Yeah, for Donald Trump, I think we're left with questions around progress. His tariff policy, it's all been about bringing jobs and manufacturing back to the United States, rebalancing trade with China. There is much, I think, about this that resets relations pretty much to where they were before Trump reignited the trade war. One step forward, one step back. His challenge, I think, is in changing the terms of engagement inside this year's grace. That will be difficult with this business of the rare earth minerals, a hefty tool. as you say, that was deployed by the Chinese quite skillfully on supply and in the processing of these minerals. Beijing is streets ahead of everybody else. They still will be in a year's time when there is a renegotiation and an assessment of what happens next. So I think overall, we're in a situation where there are more barriers to trade than there were at the start of the year. There was a meeting, yeah, it was cordial, there was agreement. So that's good news for America, China, and of course for the rest of us, because the fortunes of all of us spin on that Beijing-Washington axis.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think there was a real recognition from both parties actually going into this that a degree of stabilization was necessary. I think they've both been willing to stomach a reasonable amount of pain because of this great geopolitical standoff. But look, it was harming both economies quite seriously, I think, not to mention global supply chains, global trade, the global economy more broadly. So I think there was a recognition of that. But I think it is worth explaining that where we've ended up, I think, this morning feels a little bit more like a throwback to where we started, perhaps not even where we started. Uh, and it's not necessarily a great new dawn in the US China relationship. Let's just take soybeans as one example. I mean, Trump is touting this as a huge success that China's going to buy US soybeans. And yeah, it's relief for US farmers, but they're only going back to buying sort of roughly the same amount that they were buying last year. This is not some sort of radical step forward. When it comes to tariffs, yes, they've lowered tariffs on Chinese goods by 10 percentage points. But we're still talking about an average tariff on Chinese goods of nearly 50%. And in some sectors, it's more than that. So that is still a price that will render most sort of medium-sized enterprises trade with America sort of impossible. So we're not talking about some grand opening up that's been reached today. And I think that's really important. And I think quite aside from that, look, the economics is the easy bit. The economics is the easy bit. It's kind of not that difficult for them to reduce tensions by putting some trading relations back to what they were sort of 9 months ago. The deeper structural political divisions that still exist between these two nations. I mean, they didn't even touch on some of the slightly thornier issues, just things like the status of the island of Taiwan, things like the structure of the Chinese economy, the overproduction and dumping of goods, things like the broader disagreements over democracy and free speech. These are deep, deep, difficult issues, and they haven't even touched on that. And so I think it's very likely that they're going to be stumbling blocks again, that some of this might well end up being reneged on when another cause for disagreement comes along, which, let's face it, it quite likely will.
Yeah, we'll see how that develops. We will also see, we're told, a visit by Donald Trump to China in April next year and a return visit either to DC or Mar-a-Lago for President Xi. In approaching this meeting, Helena, am I right in saying that the Chinese, they came with a degree of self-confidence and assertiveness that perhaps we haven't seen in the past?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And for me, that's one of the big takeaways of what's happened in the last few days. But actually not just what's happened in the last few days, also how this trade war has played out throughout Donald Trump's second term and perhaps before as well. Look, China has learnt from Donald Trump's first term. Remember, the trade war actually began all the way back in sort of 2017, 2018, when Trump first started introducing tariffs on Chinese goods. And I think over the years, they have built up their economy, they have built up their technology sector, they've had a lot of breakthroughs, they've built up their power base, particularly in the global south, in parts of Asia, their allegiances, their Belt and Road Initiative, so on and so forth. And I think they are coming to this geopolitical relationship now with just significantly more confidence than what they had before. There's just a genuine belief in China that they don't need America in the way that they might have thought they needed it 10 years ago, 20 years ago. They believe that if they had to go it alone, they could, that they have the economic gravitas, that they have the technical development, that they have the political allegiances. And I think that has just really changed the whole footing of this relationship. And I think they've been therefore negotiating much more on parity than perhaps we've seen before, perhaps even the Chinese from a position of power. And I think crucially, they do hold what's considered to be the biggest trump card in all this, and that's the rare earths industry, because I think and that is the one thing that America absolutely needs. And they've shown a total willingness to use that leverage in this negotiation. I think it's worked for them. And crucially, finally, I think it's worth saying that politically for Xi Jinping, standing up to Donald Trump has been absolutely brilliant for him. You know, it has gone down brilliantly with his domestic audience. It's gone down pretty well, I think, with a lot of other Asia, global South countries who feel very bullied and very pushed around by the tariff war. So he doesn't want to be seen to yield at this stage, and he doesn't need to. And I think that is the real takeaway if we're to look forward in all this, that when the next stumbling block comes along, I think we can expect China to bring this bullishness, to bring this assertiveness to the table. And that, of course, could have big implications if it starts playing out on more political issues rather than economic ones, particularly, for example, the issue of Taiwan. Of course, the self-governing island, China sees it as its own. America, up till now, has always kept this position of strategic ambiguity where it sort of doesn't officially recognize Taiwan, but it's not said whether it would come to its defense or not. You know, and if this kind of new Chinese bullishness, particularly in the face of Donald Trump's unpredictably, were to suddenly play out on an issue like Taiwan, I think we could find ourselves in a much more precarious global situation.
Helen Ann, I saw you were reporting from South Korea. Fascinating stuff. I was particularly interested when you tried to speak to, I think, members of the public who I think were Chinese, and they seemed reluctant. What was going on there?
Yeah, it was really peculiar. So, as the press often do, we turned up outside the venue where this was happening, and there was this gaggle of people. They were all wearing matching red caps. They were all waving matching flags. Was the
Sounds
Korean
like a Trump
flag.
rally.
It was a little bit like that. One was a little bit more organized, though, I think, and I'll explain why. So they were waving flags, one sort of Korean, one Chinese, and we wandered over and we wanted to have a quick chat. And sometimes when you operate and work in China, you just know when people have been quite strictly told not to speak to you, because what happens is they don't even acknowledge you. So you go over, and I could speak a tiny bit of Chinese. So I said in Chinese, "Hi, sorry, excuse me, sorry to bother you. Do you speak English? Can we ask you a few questions?" And they sort of look away and pretend that you're not there. And you know that's when they've been directed not to speak, because if people just don't fancy doing an interview, they'll say, "Oh, hi, nice to meet you. Sorry, if you don't mind, I won't speak." So, and there was a few instances where we sort of got underway talking to someone, and very quickly, uh, sort of a man with a sort of a lanyard that described him as a delegate from the People's Republic of China came in and sort of, no, can't speak. And, they don't know anything. They don't want to, they've got nothing to add on this. So, and we realized through chatting around that essentially the gathering had been organized by the Chinese embassy in South Korea, essentially to bring sort of Chinese expat citizens there to kind of stage this lovely welcome party for Xi Jinping, to kind of show how delighted they all were for him to be there. But I think that the reason it's interesting, quite aside from it being kind of curious and unusual, is that there is just a sense that when it comes to China, paranoia and control follow it wherever it goes, even just on a street level where you're asking a couple of expat Chinese students to say that they're excited to see their leader. No, that cannot be allowed to go ahead without it being controlled and orchestrated and managed. And I think it says something really interesting about the difference of these two systems, right? As we were sort of alluding to at the top, just this clash of the way that they do things is still fundamental, and it exists. But I also think that when it comes to this big geopolitical relationship, it's about the control of the narrative as well, right? And it really matters what's said, what's communicated, who's been seen to win, who's being seen to be disadvantaged. And I think within the Chinese system, that control of the narrative, that need to control the narrative, just filters down even to the kind of lowest levels.
Yeah, and I take it access to people like President Xi is out the question, yeah?
Oh, completely impossible. I mean, unfortunately, reporting in today's China, even getting comments from sort of officials is just fleetingly difficult. I often feel jealous of you guys in America ahead of this trip. Trump's team did a full, a full background briefing. We could all log in, we could
Hmm.
all listen to it. I mean, these things are completely impossible in China. You just are left guessing most of the time. The closest we can get is some sort of academics who work for some of the big Chinese universities who talk closely with the Chinese government, help them formulate policy, things like that. Some of those type of people you can approach and get a bit of a sense of what might be going on. But yeah, it's complicated, and we are left reading a lot between the lines about what Xi Jinping wants and what the Chinese system wants to gain from all this.
Yeah, fascinating, isn't it? It's different in the different places that we operate. Best for me, in my experience, was Ireland. I don't know if you've worked there, but I was on some story, and we were outside the Irish Parliament waiting for Bertie Ahern, the Taoiseach of the day, and we just wanted a shot. And so we're kind of waiting for the speeding convoy, furrowed brow of Bertie Ahern in the passenger seat. That's what we were expecting. Sure enough, the speeding car turned up, but it was one car on its own. Gates opened, and this car, literally, as we were standing on the curb, screeched to a halt. He wound down the window, Bertie Ahern in the passenger seat, Harry Redknapp style, and said, "Morning, lads, how can I help you?" And and I had to switch on. I didn't have a question prepared, and I thought, well, that's the difference, Don't suppose you'd get that in Beijing
Oh, you would not,
any
no.
time soon. But Trump, he's quite good with the whole interpersonal thing and dealing with the media. We see that on a daily basis. We saw it, Helen Ann, on his way back to Washington, D.C. on Air Force One. The plane hit turbulence, and it's quite amusing, this plane shaking around, and the President of the United States, leader of the free world, trying to host a news conference. Have a listen.
This is a rough flight. We could have waited an hour, maybe. This is a little tough. These are tough conditions for interviews. They're going to be watching Trump. They're going to say, he didn't look too good. He's got the shakes. I don't have the shakes, but people are going to think I do. What a rough ride this is. The interviews are tough enough without your life being threatened. You guys okay? That camera guy's very steady. We're going to look real bad today on television, I'll tell you.
Donald Trump there in the seconds before he was asked to put his seatbelt back on. I'm happy to report, Helen Ann, he got back to Washington, D.C. safely.
We should say that just a few minutes before the big Xi meeting, Trump unexpectedly posted on Truth Social saying, "The United States has more nuclear weapons than any other country. This was accomplished, including a complete update and renovation of existing weapons during my first term in office. Because of the tremendous destructive power, I hated to do it, but had no choice. Russia is second and China is a distant third, but we'll be even within 5 years. Because of other countries' testing programs, I've instructed the Department of War to start testing our nuclear weapons on an equal basis. That process will begin immediately. Thanks for your attention to this matter."
They're great. They use Truth Social posts, aren't they? As we know, Helen, and that was posted on board Marine One, the helicopter, as Trump was on his way to meet Xi just minutes before they came together. Now, from an erratic and unpredictable president, any talk of anything to do with nuclear weapons sets hairs running. Why is Trump saying that? Why did he say it then? And what exactly does he mean? Well, I have to tell you, there's no hard answer to any of those questions. It's not clear, first of all, if he's referring to the testing of nuclear explosives or the missiles that actually carry these warheads. That talk of other countries' testing programs. Now, well, the Russians have conducted tests in the past couple of weeks, but these have been tests of missiles, they say, not actually nuclear weapons. The Kremlin said, we didn't know that anybody was testing. Nobody actually has tested explosive nuclear warheads, apart from North Korea in 2017. The last time the Americans did it, that was in 1992. China did it in 96. So, that Truth Social post, it's all starting to sound a bit Cold War, when you put it together with the vast sums now being spent on nuclear arms capability. And, why did Donald Trump mention it when he did? Well, I think he clearly felt it was an occasion for deterrence, for saber rattling, shaping a context, I think, that carried a reminder of America's superpower status. And with it, I think it carried a degree of implicit threat. And of course, that's the danger in all of this. Where does that particular road end?
Yeah, and he said in that post that these tests are happening to put America on what he calls an equal basis with Russia and China. But it's a really sizable shift in US policy, and it does feel quite similar to what we saw in the Cold War era. The Kremlin have since said that they'll respond in kind. And of course, that's the big risk, isn't it, with this sort of suggestion of an escalation, that they're also ready to test their nuclear weapons.
Yeah, Donald Trump's words have caused unease, no doubt. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, he said the current nuclear risks are already alarmingly high. And he said nuclear testing can never be permitted under any circumstances. We did mention Helena, North Korea, and their nuclear weapons testing. One person we didn't see featuring on Donald Trump's travels was his old friend Kim Jong-un. Trump seemed keen to hook up with him again, but the leader of the Hermit Kingdom, he wasn't coming out to play.
Did you ever get through to Kim Jong-un about setting up a meeting? Does he have a phone?
We never were able to talk because I was so busy, and really this is why we came. I think it would have been maybe disrespectful to the importance of this meeting if we did that. So I'd come back with respect to Kim Jong-un. I'd come back if it was.
What do you want to talk about?
That's not the whole picture, though. In truth, Trump publicly pushed for a meeting. Perhaps he wants to stretch his peacemaking efforts to the hostilities between North and South Korea. It's worth saying he brought that up quite a few times during his time in South Korea this week. He actually told President Lee of South Korea over dinner the other night, he was like, you know, that problem you've got with North Korea, don't worry, we'll get that one fixed for you. So pretty optimistic. But it seems that for the moment, at least, the North Koreans weren't interested. Worth saying, Kim Jong-un is in a pretty different position now than he was back in 2019 when he was keen to thaw relations with America. But ever since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the North Koreans have sided more and more with the Russians. They've really worked hard to start. They've really worked hard to try and build up that allegiance. They've rejected normalization with the US. They've lent Russia a lot of troops in exchange for technical know-how and weaponry. I'm not saying it's impossible that Trump and Kim Jong-un could meet again. I think actually reading between the lines, it's likely that they are considering it. But if it happens, it will need to be very carefully orchestrated and not thrown together at the last minute on the sidelines of Xi Jinping here and Trump here. And I think for the North Koreans, that would have been just a little bit too disorganized. So despite Trump's posturing, for now, he's ignored.
Helen Ann, many thanks for joining us again on Trump 100. Back to Beijing for you now, yeah?
That's right. Back to Beijing, I think today, but we'll see. Thanks so much for having me. I always enjoy it.
Always our pleasure. What are you missing from the UK when you're over in China? The
That's a
football?
great question. Football, yeah, I guess. But you know what I really miss is being able to drink the tap water. That is the thing I miss the most. Genuinely. I find that so difficult.
You're not talking about London tap water, I take it.
I am actually. It's a bit better than Beijing tap water, I can assure you. You know, the other thing I really miss actually is green grass. I know that sounds crazy, but Beijing's actually officially a desert. Like it almost never rains. So everything is really, really dry and really brown almost all of the time. And I miss the lawn, you know?
The green, green grass of home. There's a song in there somewhere.
I know.
Helen Ann, thank you. It's been a pleasure. Come back and see us soon. Thank you very much for listening. Have a good weekend. And if you want to watch or read any of Helen Ann's analysis of her time in South Korea, covering the Trump-Xi meeting, we'll put a couple of links in the episode description. And do give us a follow wherever you get your podcasts. And also, please do leave a review as well. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.